The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
A 10,000-person choir annually singing the Ode to Joy. Hip-hop artists sampling signature symphonic riffs. Tonight, on the 250th anniversary of the birth of Ludwig van Beethoven, we're examining the contemporary significance of perhaps the greatest composer of all time. Then, author and analyst George Weigel explains why his new book offers a blueprint for the papacy beyond Francis. That's our Ode to Joy on this Wednesday, December 16th, and it's all coming up next on The Agenda. A quarter of a millennium ago, perhaps the most renowned, admired, and beloved composer of classical music was born. All these years later, what makes the work of Ludwig van Beethoven still so compelling? And why, given how different our world is from that of 1770 Germany, are there celebrations around the world for him today? Let's find out. And as is our custom, we'll introduce our guests from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in Vienna, Austria, with composer Walter Versowa, owner and head of the audio branding firm Musikvergnügen. In New York, New York, Canadian pianist Lisa Yui, who is an educator at the Manhattan School of Music. And in Weston, Connecticut, there's conductor Peter Ungen, who from 2004 to 2018 was the music director and maestro for the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. And it's great to have you three with us on this auspicious occasion in musical history. Just before we start our conversation, want to throw a few factoids your way, just to set up the discussion to come. Now, according to a website that is the largest classical events finder online, of the 20,000 classical concerts in 2019, more than 13% featured a work by Beethoven. And this made him the top concert composer, followed by two guys named Mozart and J.S. Bach. According to the 2020 Classic FM Hall of Fame survey, based on a 170,000 vote survey, the most featured composers were Beethoven with 17 entries, Mozart had 17, and then Bach and Tchaikovsky rounded up with 15. And finally, when the BBC's Music magazine asked 174 living composers this year to choose 5 of the greatest composers by originality, impact, craftsmanship, and enjoyability, the one that came out on top was J.S. Bach, followed by Igor Stravinsky, and then Beethoven and Mozart, which just goes to show you that 174 living composers don't know as much as 170,000 ordinary voters. That's my 2 cents. Let's get into this. I would love, Peter, I'll start with you. I would love to be able to empirically prove that Beethoven is the greatest ever, not just as a matter of opinion, but as a matter of fact. Is it possible to actually do that?
I don't think so. Fortunately, it's art. It's about creativity, and it's about how we all react to it independently. But there is no question that the music of Beethoven holds within it an unbelievable emotional power and a grasp on us as humanity, which is almost second to none. But on the other hand, if you ask any of us as musicians who is our favorite composer, we're mostly going to say pretty much it's the composer whose music I'm playing or conducting at this moment. Having said that, it would be very difficult if given the choice to only have one composer to listen to in my life, that I would discard the music of Beethoven, because it is so broad, it's so powerful, and it's so spiritual and so full of consolation.
Right. Lisa, how about to you? Is it possible to prove that Beethoven was the greatest ever?
No, I don't think it is possible to put numbers to art in that manner. But certainly, it's clear from these polls that his music speaks to a great variety of people, and I think that is due to the incredible humanism of his music, and that combines humanity, intellect, and I think more than any other composer in the Western classical music, there is a completeness to Beethoven's music that is almost akin to Shakespeare's plays.
Walter, I wonder whether we have to take into account, when we're trying to consider the greatest of all time, the fact that this man did some of his best work when he could not hear a thing. Surely we have to take that into account, don't we?
We definitely have to. And his composing style changed because of his deafness. And sometimes I think because he was such a powerful man who his world was his own world and freedom was something so important for him that he kind of decided internally not to listen to the world, and the world had to listen to him.
Peter, I wonder whether, well, I suspect there's not a good answer to this question, just like the first one was equally as impossible to answer, but let me try anyway. Writing the Ninth Symphony while deaf and suffering from tinnitus as well, I understand, it's hard to imagine a more magnificent achievement in the history of culture, frankly. Is it conceivable that the Ninth might have been even better had he had his hearing?
I think we would probably all argue that is not the case. I mean, you talk about his deafness and his tinnitus. That began actually very, very early when he was in his 20s still. He was very much aware of this, and it was a tragedy in his life for the bulk of his composing career, actually. Therefore, by the time he wrote the Ninth Symphony just a few years before he died in 1827, he wrote it probably 1823, 1824, we would think. He had written literally hundreds of pieces of music virtually without being able to hear them. And my sense, in fact, is that the fact that he couldn't hear actually allowed his imagination to go into places where it possibly otherwise would not have gone. And the best case of that would be the Grosser Fugue, which is an incredibly dissonant piece of music. I sometimes wonder whether if he had been able to actually hear it, whether he would have had the daring, the guts to present that to the public. So it's a very interesting subject.
Lisa, can you just follow up on that? How is it possible for somebody to compose something so magnificent when you can't actually hear what you're composing?
There are actually a surprisingly large number of artists who were disabled in a certain aspect. And what comes to mind is Milton, for example. And perhaps there is this idea of becoming more visionary when you lose a certain sense. And in the case of Beethoven, he received from the Broadwood Company the most up-to-date pianoforte. And this was in around 1814 or so. And Beethoven composed his final sonatas on this instrument when he couldn't even hear this piano. But one can imagine, what he imagined he heard. And I think this is part of the reason why the final sonatas are so beyond his time, because he actually imagined the sounds that could be heard and tried to translate this onto a sheet of paper.
Walter, just before I ask you the next question, let me set it up by reading an excerpt from an article in The New Yorker by Alex Ross, who's the music critic there. It goes like this: Beethoven is a singularity in the history of art, a phenomenon of dazzling and disconcerting force. He not only left his mark on all subsequent composers, but also molded entire institutions. The professional orchestra arose in large measure as a vehicle for the incessant performance of Beethoven's symphonies. The art of conducting emerged in his wake. The modern piano bears the imprint of his demand for a more resonant and flexible instrument. Listening underwent a fundamental change. To follow Beethoven's dense, driving narratives, one had to lean forward and pay close attention. In the course of the 19th century, dead composers began to crowd out the living on concert programs, and a canon of masterpieces materialized with Beethoven front and center. That's Alex Ross from The New Yorker. Do you agree, Walter, that Beethoven not only was a musical genius, but that he actually changed the way music was done in such a way that even today we continue to perform it more than anybody else?
Absolutely. He was not only an incredible composer, he was an incredible conductor. He was a piano player, he improvised, and a lot of his work came out of that. I would like to only add one thing to the not hearing part. those geniuses hear the music in the head, and it might be a little bit different to hear it actually in the physical world or in the head. And they pen it down, they write it down as if you can think a sentence and write it down. So those composers often control or check what they've written on the piano, and it goes back and forth. But his scale was so different that he could imagine anything and write it down.
So, Peter, that does harken back to the point you just made, which was he did live for 20-something years where he could hear, so therefore he knew what it was supposed to sound like, right? Fair to say?
Absolutely fair to say. I mean, what I entirely agree with Walter saying that this is one of the most extraordinary things is that many composers in the history of time don't use a keyboard to compose with, and many do use a keyboard, but they can hear everything in their head. I mentioned that only about the Grosse Fuge because it's so daring to do that kind of a thing, that maybe it made him a little bit more free to express himself, that he became such a revolutionary.
And let me follow up with you, Peter, on this one as well, because Alex Ross from The New Yorker also wrote in that same piece, Beethoven's an artist almost too great for the good of his art. And I wanted to sort of dive a little deeper on that and try to understand, how can you be too great for the goodness of your art? What does that mean?
Well, I suppose it's like trying to dance after Nureyev has lived or Baryshnikov has lived. You know, it makes it even more difficult to try to achieve anything. But I mean, for us, I think Beethoven's a great inspiration. But then I'm a performer, not a composer. I think it is very intimidating. And obviously Brahms, for example, said many times that it's incredibly intimidating to try to write a symphony after the greatness of Beethoven. And it took him until he was in his 40s to even dare to present a symphony to the world. So too great, I don't think is possible to say, because it's such a gift to all humanity to have all of that. And I think still today he inspires a great number of composers. In fact, this year, of course, a lot of pieces have been composed in his memory.
Mm-hmm. Let's show this clip coming up here. This is quite extraordinary because the Ninth was performed apparently 112 times in December alone in Japan. They love Beethoven in Japan. But the big annual event that they do for 39 years straight is the performance of the Ninth with a, if you can imagine this, 10,000 person choir singing the Ode to Joy. Boy, what this would be like to be in the hall and hear that. Let's have a look. Sheldon, if you would. Lisa, what are you feeling right this second?
The humanism of Beethoven. I think what makes Beethoven eternal and so very popular around the globe is that his language, what he is expressing, is common to all mankind. There's humor, there's life, there's suffering, there is tragedy, and there's hope. And I believe that Beethoven's music is always life-affirming. And this Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy, follows great apocalyptic destruction. But that's never where he leaves us. And I think this is what makes Beethoven's music so appealing to the world.
Lisa, you've performed in Japan, have you not?
I have. I was born in Japan.
Okay. Tell me this, because he's obviously not from there. He's from Germany. Why is there such an apparently powerful connection between Japan and Beethoven?
Well, the Japanese culture, I mean, they love Western music, and it has been an incredibly important part of the culture for many, many years. And I think it's just the strength of Beethoven is so apparent that I think any culture that embraces Western music so fully as the Japanese do will do so with as great enthusiasm. And the Japanese do everything very big.
Right. Well, mind you, Walter, the European Union's official national anthem, if we can call it that, is the Ode to Joy. It is that song, and it's been the anthem since 1972. No words, just the music. Do you think it actually helps all the different nationalities in Europe feel more European?
Yes, it's the context, and music is a lot about context. It's not just the music, and Beethoven was humanitarian, and he wanted to bring all brothers together. And early on, they just found, I think 2 years ago, a letter of his. When he was 17 years old, he already penned out those thoughts of that we should unite and be one. So yes, the whole context around that work embraces it.
Alle Menschen wären Brüder.
Yeah, wir sind alle Brüder. And we have to note that the Fifth Symphony is somewhere in a golden CD going through the universe as the message. So Beethoven is everywhere.
Now, I hate to bring too much politics into this, Maestro Ungen, but the fact is that that spirit of European unification apparently did not hit Great Britain when it came to voting on Brexit last time. So maybe Beethoven is mortal after all?
Yeah, I think they wanted Elgar. I think they were offended that Elgar had not been chosen, probably. Yeah, well, we don't have to get into the subject of Brexit. It's been a bit of a disaster, should we say, in any case. But just to go back for a moment, just to see all those Japanese people, I think most people know that I played in the Tokyo String Quartet with 3 Japanese for a long time. And to see them all singing it so beautifully from memory. And if you notice the one shot of the conductor, he wasn't even beating time because the discipline is so great and the understanding of the music so deep that they didn't even need leadership, really. So that was an extremely moving thing to watch.
I did want to ask you about that because I noticed that too. He wasn't doing anything. He was taking it in. Now you've actually been in his place, obviously. Why do you think he did that?
He knew they didn't need him. And in any case, from that distance, they couldn't really see him all that well. But because once something is going, as it were, the last thing anybody wants, whether they're singing or playing an instrument, is to have somebody beating at them. In fact, if you stop beating, everybody just understands, we're just flowing through this series of phrases or this phrase, and it's very liberating.
Peter, I imagine you've heard the Ninth hundreds, if not thousands of times. And when you get a little excerpt like that, which, you're not there, you're just watching it on a monitor, and it's not the whole thing, it's 30 seconds of it. Does something still happen inside you?
Every time. Totally exhilarating. But I mean, that happens with a lot of music. And if I think, at the moment, Beethoven's on our minds. If I go through my head and think of the beginning of the Hammerklavier Sonata or the beginning of almost any of his great works, it's a sense of unbelievable internal joy and gratitude, frankly.
Let me play a bit of killjoy here, and that is, Lisa, I'll put this to you. There has been a debate emerging in some circles of late that Beethoven is, quote unquote, too elitist. And the argument goes that for women and LGBTQ people of color, Beethoven's music is predominantly a reminder of what they would consider to be classical music's history of exclusion and elitism. What do you think of this argument?
This is a very important subject, and as an educator who is really, I'm part of a committee just looking over the curriculum of Manhattan School of Music where I teach. This has been a topic that we have been reflecting all year. First of all, I'm not quite sure what elitism really means in this case. Does it mean that the music is very complex? Well, it's certainly not popular music, and popular music is the purpose of popular music is to be able to be integrated very, very easily. The Beethoven's music is complex. Classical music is complex because it is expressing more complex ideas. And hopefully the results, the outcome that we receive from it will be greater and deeper as well. Is it about the price of classical concerts? Well, I think many sports events or rock concerts cost much, much more. But is it about the exclusivity of certain audiences? That is a problem that we should address. And I think it is important that we start supporting the music of today that is reflective of the composers and the performers of today. And it is true that concert halls and music conservatory curriculums have not really changed over the past 100, even maybe perhaps 200 years. And that's something that we need to address, but that has nothing to do with Beethoven's music. And I think we could, there is space for everything. And so it's not Beethoven's music that we need to blame, but the way that we organize concerts and the prices of concerts and to educate the audience. I think that's the most important thing.
Well, okay, you know what? I'm having a debate with myself here as to whether or not to play this next clip or let the guy who programmed a decade and a half worth of Toronto Symphony Orchestra concerts should have a chance to weigh in on that one. Okay, Peter, why don't you weigh in on that one first? Elitism, what do you say?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what Lisa's saying. I mean, in fact, for 14 years, I was saying, look, this is too formal. We've got to make people feel more comfortable to come to the hall, feel welcome, because conductors traditionally would walk on the stage, stand on the podium, take a bow, and then turn their backs, and that was the end of that communication. So, as most people know who came to a concert, I would always welcome the audience, the listeners, in some way at some point at a concert. And I totally agree. I think it's the context that we've set up and the fact that we don't make it accessible enough to people when they're young. The Toronto Symphony at one time was playing for 100,000 students every single year. That's become more and more difficult with busing and traffic and all the 21st century technological developments which prevent people from going places as much. But I think the live music experience it has formalized over the many, many years too much. And even the lack of applause, frankly, which didn't exist in Beethoven's time. Of course, they applauded every movement, and that's how those movements were encored. It didn't make everybody happy all the time because they also talked too much, and so on. But we have to find a way, definitely, to make everything feel more accessible and more comfortable, and understand that we live in the context where there's very popular music, which is almost entirely very tonal, which people love in their millions.
Well, if this next clip that we're about to play is not a manifestation of what the maestro just referred to, then I don't know what is. We all know there's nothing elitist about YouTube, so here comes a clip from YouTube. There's a genre of react channels on YouTube where vloggers react to music they have not heard before. And one of those vloggers goes by the name of Mr. Video. He's from Toledo, Ohio. Here's a clip of him discovering Beethoven for the very first time. Sheldon, if you would.
I saw the Beethoven movie with the dog, and the dog ran to the piano and started playing the piano. And that made me look up Beethoven, and I seen, oh, it's an actual person. I never heard any of the symphonies so I don't even know what I'm about to get into, honestly. Man. I'm teary-eyed. I don't know what the hell this is doing to me right now. This shit is beautiful. Damn, Beethoven. Okay, so this is the 5th symphony. What is 1, 2, and 3, and 4 like? We gotta get into those too. Damn. Oh man, you close your eyes and this takes you just somewhere else. You let the music touch you.
It doesn't seem to be too elitist, Walter, for Mr. Video. He had the goosebumps going big time there. What do you think?
Beautiful. I wish he was in the audience when Beethoven was performing, and he would have loved him. And this music has so much effect on us, and there are even medical studies of what it does to our physiology. It's overwhelming, and I don't buy the elitist statement. I think music is for all of us at any time. And there are more and more concerts where we have more openness and room for enjoying in the moment.
Lisa, do you want to come back at that?
Absolutely. I mean, this video gives me so much pleasure, and it reminds me why I have chosen to be a performer and a teacher. It's because it's not enough for me to simply enjoy this music, and I want to show people what makes it so beautiful, and for them to experience that as well. And this is something that I think everyone, all musicians, should really be aiming for, because this is absolutely beautiful.
Well, Lisa, maybe you could follow up by telling us I mean, you hear it and you react, as we just saw in that clip, but can you kind of explain to us why the Fifth, why the Ninth, why the Moonlight Sonata, why Für Elise have lasted so popularly for so long? What is it about those pieces in particular?
If I could tell you, I would make a business out of selling the information to all composers. I think there's a combination of order. He is composing in a very, analyzable form, right? There are certain phrase structures, and there are certain just forms that he's following. And so there's a common language that he's speaking. And then the rest is, of course, mystery, right? And this is why I think computers are never going to compose anything that will be deeply life-changing for us, because the element of mystery and surprise are lacking in these cases.
Well, I wonder if I should... I was going to go there later, but since you've jumped into this now, I wonder whether we should do this now. Maybe we should. Walter, Beethoven's 10th Symphony. Yes, I know people are asking me right now, 10th Symphony, what do you mean? He only wrote 9. Well, you're kind of involved in the 10th. Do you want to just explain what all that's about?
Yes, love to. Beethoven, when he was alive, he sketched out motifs for his 10th Symphony. He always wrote 2 symphonies at once and jumped back and forth. And he passed before he could really make the 10th that full work. And there are a couple of snippets and motifs. There are 2 bars, 3 bars, 4 bars, some are 20 bars. And we started teaching AI how Beethoven composed, and in a very different way. And when Lisa said, it's like, I totally agree, and computers themselves won't be able to compose. But imagine you turn a computer into a student, and one of your students, and teach that student all the rules by just listen to the music and feed that corpus. We call it that corpus. And we've done this with Ahmed Elgamal at Rutgers University, and he's this brilliant computer scientist. And the AI learned, deep machine learning, what is in the works. So it took even the essence out there. It took maybe the love sickness. It's like all the emotions which are packed in the music, all that information was taken in by AI. And then AI took those seeds, those motifs, and started composing away. And in the beginning, there were surprises that it didn't really get us. But then the more the AI learned and the more we helped there, I had those goosebumps we just saw in that other video. And it's stunning what is possible with a good student.
Well, let's give our viewers a sense of what you're talking about. Here's 30 seconds of Beethoven's 10th. Sheldon. Okay, Walter, we need to understand how much of that was written by Ludwig van Beethoven and how much was written by machine learning artificial intelligence.
So on this one, he pointed to his Partitik theme, which he wrote when he was much, much younger, 30 years younger. And but he already changed a couple of notes when he penned the sketch down. He didn't harmonize it. So we had 12 bars of the Partitik theme, fed it into the AI, and we received this orchestration back.
Wow. Peter Ungen, we know that humans are no longer the best at playing chess. We're no longer the best at Jeopardy. Are you concerned about what direction this is going in, that we may no longer be the best at composing classical music?
Well, not particularly, because I mean that's a fascinating thing that we just heard. But it is the material of Beethoven, and it's finding the initial motives and the initial ideas that is the most difficult thing, according to most composers. So the AI, I think, won't be able to do that. For me, it's hard to explain because I can't even believe I managed to get on Skype. So it's a world way beyond my imagination. But I think there's something about the human contact and the feeling of human beings creating something and achieving something and then transmitting it to other human beings that will always be of enormous value.
Well, let me put that to Lisa. Would it matter to you, Lisa, if you were playing something that you knew had been created by artificial intelligence as opposed to a human being?
Not very. I mean, if it's moving to me, it's moving to me, and I'm willing to be surprised and evolve with the times. But in the meantime, I think this pandemic has shown us how much we miss live performances. And I think despite all these videos and recordings that we have access to, we miss the sense of the risk and the beauty of the surprises and the human contact. And so I think at least for the time being, we will be still relying on live music by human beings. But if that changes, things change. And I'm always willing to be open to be moved by anything that moves me.
Let's just finish up in our remaining moments here with, we started with a bit of an imponderable question, so it only seems fair that we end with one as well. The culture, Peter, that created Beethoven, Mozart, Bach, that culture no longer exists. Does that mean that we are no longer going to see musical geniuses like them in the future?
Well, I'm not sure which particular culture you're referring to, because obviously there's music in people's homes, and all three of those people were surrounded by music from a very young age. So obviously the times are different. We're talking about centuries later, very different influences and very different abilities also to hear music, because in those days you could only hear music if you played it or sang it. Nowadays, of course, on Spotify, you don't have to have any ability to play anything. You can hear any music you like. So that's changed a lot. But I think essentially in every other way, as far as I can see, it's all the same thing. I mean, if I talk to composer friends of mine, they go through the same kinds of struggles that we imagine that the great composers of the past went through. And it's that human element, it's that struggle to achieve. And we talk about Beethoven, his life was really not pleasant. His father was very tough on him. He would improvise as a young kid, and his father said, "No, stop making things up, play music that I've given you to play." He was always being criticized, and out of that and everything else that happened in his life comes this need, I think, to console the world, when he could actually, in a way, personally never console himself. So it's that gift, that kind of longing that I think is still in the minds of composers today and will always be.
I can't tell you how grateful I am to the three of you for celebrating Beethoven's 250th birthday with us here on TVO tonight. Walter, Lisa, Peter, so great to be with you, and may he reign for another 250 years and more.
Well said.
Thank you.
He will. Thank you.
Tomorrow on the agenda.
You get less of this oxytocin when you're text messaging people instead of calling them, hearing their voice. And most likely, there is no research really yet on Zoom and stuff like this. I'm guessing it's coming, but when you see people, you get even more of that. So it's really also important to choose well how we are connecting, and exactly text messaging really should be at the bottom of our lists.
That's tomorrow on the agenda. Pope Francis has only been the Pontifex Maximus for 7 years. But tomorrow, December 17th, he will turn 84 years old, and apparently that has prompted one of the Catholic Church's most fervent experts to begin considering life after Francis. George Weigel has just written The Next Pope, The Office of Peter and a Church in Mission. And he joins us now from North Bethesda, Maryland. It's so good to see you again. George, how you doing?
Thanks, Steve. I'm fine. Hope you and your family are well, too.
I appreciate that, and yes, we're all doing just fine. Now, we should start by saying you have known personally the last three popes, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and now Pope Francis. And I have to say, if I were Pope Francis, I'd be wondering, why is he writing a book about the next pope? I only started this job 7 years ago. I still think I have a lot to do, so why are you writing about the next pope already?
Well, in fact, Steve, as you know, this book is really about everyone in the Catholic Church and everyone's responsibility for the future of the Church, although I look at that through the prism of this unique office called the Office of Peter or the Papacy. And it's never too soon to start thinking about the future. In fact, as you probably remember, there was much speculation about the future of the papacy in the last 10 years of the life of John Paul II. The speculation about life after Pope Benedict began 5 minutes after he was elected. So there's really nothing new about this. I have had a unique privilege of knowing the present Pope and his two immediate predecessors. And at a time of some stress and confusion in the Church, it seemed to me a useful idea to pull together what I had learned from those encounters over the past 30-some years into this small book reflecting on the future of the entire Church through the prism of the office of the papacy.
Well, I do have to say, for what is admittedly a very small book, you really have hit on all of the big and thorniest and most difficult issues that the next pope is going to have to deal with, and you have described your church as being, quote, at a critical breaking point. What do you mean by that?
Well, the next pope, whoever he is, will not have been affected by the Second Vatican Council, the decisive event in the modern history of the Church, the way John Paul II, Benedict XVI, or Francis has been. John Paul II and Benedict XVI were both major players in the great event of the Second Vatican Council. Pope Francis was a young Jesuit during those years and a religious superior in the turbulent years immediately after the council. The next pope might have been a teenager or even a child at the time of the Second Vatican Council. So we're going to have the first truly post-conciliar pope. Perhaps even more importantly, though, the next pope will be confronted with a situation that each of his three predecessors has tried to address. And that is the fact that some parts of the Catholic Church are living and some parts are dying. It seems to me that the living parts of the Church are those that have embraced the Second Vatican Council as interpreted by John Paul II and Benedict XVI as a call to become a missionary enterprise again. And the dying parts of the Church are those that haven't quite gotten that message yet, that are still focused on institutional maintenance, or that imagine that a church that simply imitates the surrounding culture is attractive, which I think the experience of the Church in Germany, for example, suggests is not the case. So this is what's facing the entire Church in the future, but that challenge confronts the Bishop of Rome in a particular way.
I am fascinated that you seem to be saying in the book that the Church has, in some respects, lost its way, and that is not a reference to the child abuse scandal, but actually, in the half century since John the 23rd was the Pope, you think the Church needs a refocusing on Jesus Christ. And that would seem pretty obvious to say on the face of it, but what more are you saying beyond that?
The Second Vatican Council was called by Pope John the 23rd precisely to re-energize the Church as a missionary enterprise, as a communion of disciples in mission. I think there are still too many Catholics today who think of the Church primarily as an institution rather than a movement. And yet the living parts of the world Church, the growing parts of the world Church, are precisely those that think of the Church in movement terms, a movement of deep friendship with the Lord Jesus Christ, a movement to share that friendship with others. This is most spectacularly evident in the remarkable, even fantastic growth of the church in sub-Saharan Africa over the past several decades. But it's actually true wherever you see the world church living and growing, where Christ is at the center, where mission and offering others the possibility of friendship with Christ is at the center. The church is thriving. Where the institution is at the center and keeping the institution ticking over, things are not in quite so good shape.
Let me do an excerpt from the book here. You write, Christianity is not a pious myth. Rather, Christianity rests on certain historical events, things that happened to real men and women at a certain time in a defined place. And those events, preeminently the encounter with the risen Lord, whom those men and women had first known as the Rabbi Jesus from Nazareth, transformed hitherto timid and marginal people into a communion of disciples that launched a religious revolution. I was interested in why you felt a need to say that.
Church always needs to be reminded, Steve, that it began tethered to reality, tethered to historical reality, tethered to a certain time and place. That's why John Paul II went to the Holy Land during the Great Jubilee of 2000, to remind the church that this didn't just get made up somehow, that real lives were changed. Those lives went out and changed the world, and that's the foundation on which the Christian proposal rests. Christianity is not just an idea. Pope Benedict was insistent on this, and it was striking that he was. I mean, Pope Benedict may have been the most learned man in the world, and yet this profound intellectual insisted, I'm not the leader of a church that's basically an idea. I'm the leader of a church that is basically about an encounter with the incarnate Son of God and with his brothers and sisters whom we call Christians. That's something the church needs to be reminded of all the time.
You do ask some good and tough questions in this book, and some of those good and tough questions are going to get you into trouble, if I may say, George, with some people who don't feel the same way about these issues as you do. And let me just read some of them here. Do the teachings of the Lord Jesus and St. Paul on the ethics of human love and what makes for a love that fosters happiness and beatitude remain true and binding for today? Or has the sexual revolution empowered us to see more clearly on these matters than the Lord Jesus, St. Paul, and the consistent reaching of the church for 2 millennia? Okay, what's the answer?
The answer is those teachings are binding. How they are taught, how they are lived pastorally is something that the church must constantly work at. And we need to do a better job, as I think you and I have discussed on this program before, of explaining the yes that lies behind everything to which the church says no. The church can come across sometimes as simply a naysayer, and there are some things to which the church has to say no. We would all agree that the church has to say no to slavery. We all would agree, I think, that the church has to say no to the abuse of persons in any form, including sexual abuse. Those no's are based on yeses. They're based on a concept of the dignity of the human person that is ultimately derived from the Bible. And either you believe and accept the belief that there are some fixed points of reference for Christian life, or you end up with a Christianity of porous boundaries that really isn't all that interesting. No one is interested, I don't think, in a Christianity that simply mirrors the spirit of the age. That got the church into big trouble throughout history. It should be a lesson that has been learned from history. There are reference points, and we need to know them.
Well, this is where I come in and say, okay, but what did you think of the relatively gay positive comments made by the Pope not too long ago?
The Pope correctly reminded everyone that people who experience same-sex attraction are human beings with an inalienable dignity and value. They are not to be shunned. They are not to be disowned by their families. That's wickedness. That kind of prejudice and shunning is wickedness. To say that does not settle any questions of public policy about the nature of marriage or other arrangements that human beings might wish to see under the protection of civil law. But the yes is to the dignity of every human person. Everyone deserves respect as a son or daughter of God.
He did go further than any previous pope, however, in acknowledging what you have just said. And, you know, the world didn't end when he said it. So what did you infer from that?
I'm sorry, the world didn't end when he said it. I don't think popes have world-ending capacity these days. Look, the Pope made a prudential judgment that in certain circumstances, including the one he faced in Argentina when he was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, civil unions, legally established, are something the Catholic Church can live with. That may not be the case in other circumstances. So he made a prudential judgment. He did not make a change in the Church's doctrine about the nature of marriage. He didn't make the change in the Church's doctrine about the ethics of human love. He simply made a prudential judgment about certain political situations.
Okay. George, I do know that the Lord works in mysterious ways. I'm not saying that facetiously at all. And what I'm about to ask you, you actually don't talk about it all in the book, but I want to ask you about it anyway. And that is, I wonder whether you think that the Christian and/or Catholic communities have taken a reputational hit over the last 4 years because they frankly so brazenly ignored the disgraceful shortcomings of the still current President of the United States in order to get more conservative judges on the American judiciary. What's your view on that?
I don't think the Catholic Church in the United States has embraced President Trump in some uncritical way. There have been lots of Catholics, myself included, who have been critical of various aspects of this administration. I actually led a totally unsuccessful movement to prevent his nomination as the Republican candidate in 2016. On the other hand, he has appointed what I would call law reading rather than law writing justices to the Supreme Court and to the federal bench, and that will likely provide more robust protections for religious freedom in the United States going forward. But there has certainly not been an uncritical embrace of the Trump administration or the Obama administration or the George W. Bush administration. There is no political faction or party that completely expresses the fullness of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church, and there likely never will be. So I'm not so concerned about the hit that the church has taken, allegedly taken on Trump. The continuing abuse scandals are an open wound in the church that I think we have made some important advances in addressing, but those continue to hurt the body of Christ in a serious way. Pope Francis has tried to address this. John Paul II and Benedict XVI tried to address it. I address it in the book in terms of the reform of seminaries and the reform of the priesthood. We're making some progress on this, but we always have to remember the obligation to victims.
Well, of course, the great irony of the political situation in the United States over the past 4 years, and certainly over the past several months that Joe Biden has been the Democratic nominee and now the president-elect is that Biden's a Catholic, Biden goes to church, Biden is a man of faith. I mean, the current president is none of those things. Biden has surely suffered during the course of his life, and yet I think it's fair to say that the most fervent and most religious Catholics, evangelical Christians, be it as it may, did everything they could to try to prevent Joe Biden from becoming president and really went to the wall to keep the guy who's put judges they like on the courts, but who in virtually every other way is a pretty disgraceful human being. Can you make sense of that for us?
I think there's great concern among serious Catholics, serious evangelical Protestants about President-elect Biden's long embrace of the most extreme form of the abortion license. There is real concern about whether he understands the meaning of religious freedom in full. His promise to take the Little Sisters of the Poor, a Catholic order of nuns, to court over their disinclination to provide contraceptive and abortifacient materials to their employees under federal health care provisions is a cause of deep concern. You know, I wrote a column during the campaign, Steve, in which I suggested that Mr. Biden is really kind of a pre-Vatican II Catholic. I mean, he always talks about having his rosary with him when President Obama launched the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. Well, that's to treat the rosary as a kind of good luck charm. That's rather preconciliar. Biden deals with senior Catholic authorities, you know, as if they were simply power brokers rather than men with whom he might have a serious conversation about the complex moral issues of public policy. That's very preconciliar. I don't doubt that Joe Biden's faith was crucial in helping him endure and get through some very tough circumstances in his life. What I and others who are very concerned about his public policy positions are going to do is, first of all, pray for him. This man, whatever we think of his public policy positions, is a Christian brother for whose full conversion I and others are going to pray, and then we're going to do what we can in the public sphere to protect unborn human life, to prevent the widespread catastrophe of physician-assisted suicide, and to protect religious freedom for everyone, not just for Catholics.
Okay, back to the book here. I know you would like to see a lot more fiscal transparency and probity in the Church's financial matters. That is something that has seemed to have been beyond the reach of any pope, let alone the ones that you have known. What makes you think the next pope is going to have any more luck at that?
First, Steve, he's going to have to address it because it's entirely possible that in the next 6 months, the Holy See, the Vatican, is going to be in the severest financial crisis in its history. It may even be bankrupt. This is a combination of incompetence, malfeasance, corruption, bad investments. So the pressure on the present pope, who has made some advances in dealing with these problems, but the pressure on his successor to really clean house and to make it clear to the people whose charitable donations make the Catholic Church possible that there is transparency and accountability. I think something that has to be addressed here is the much more effective use of lay Catholics in the management of church finances. Ordination to the priesthood or the episcopate does not confer financial shrewdness or probity on anybody. And it's time that we stop pretending that it did, especially in terms of Rome. There is there is a deep need for men and women of demonstrated financial competence to handle the finances of the Vatican. And the next Pope needs to address that vigorously and quickly.
George, in our last minute here, I want to ask you one more thing, and that is you have written a book that essentially lays out a path that you hope the next Pope will take. Do you, or I guess, how optimistic are you that whoever gets the calling will in fact follow this path that you've laid out?
Well, I'm hopeful, Steve, that this book helps everyone in the Church, including the next Pope and the man who will select him, to think in a calm, measured way about the last 50 years of Catholic history, what they've taught us, what the last three popes have taught us, both in what they've achieved and what they failed to achieve, and that we can move into the future with confidence that the Holy Spirit is still at work in the Church, helping us understand how to be the missionary disciples that we all have to be.
As always, you give us so much to think about. George Weigel, the next Pope, the office of Peter, and a church in mission. Great to have you on TVO again, as always. I hope you're well.
Thanks, Steve. Always good to be with you.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, December 16th, 2020. Have these physically distanced, sometimes socially awkward times altered the nature of friendship? Tomorrow we'll explore that. Also, a conversation about the thoroughly underappreciated former Prime Minister, Louis Saint Laurent. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.